In the chronicles of British royalty, few deaths have been as revolting, as pitiful, or as entirely stripped of dignity as that of King George IV. When he exhaled his last breath on June 26, 1830, the man once celebrated as the first gentleman of England had degenerated into a monstrous parody of majesty, a swollen, decaying bulk of flesh that repulsed even those paid to serve him. His end was less the passing of a king than the extinguishing of a grotesque living corpse, deserted by his people and condemned by posterity. The shift from charming prince to despised monarch had taken decades to unfold, but in his later years the decline accelerated at a terrifying pace. What follows is not just the chronicle of a royal death, but the complete collapse of a human being, a warning tale of absolute power, warped by endless indulgence, told through the experiences of those who witnessed George's wretched final decline. Before we start, please don't forget to subscribe to Rotten Ages if you like to hear dark tales from the past. George Augustus Frederick was born on August 12, 1762, the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. As a child, he enjoyed every gift a royal birth could bestow: sharp intelligence, striking features, and a captivating personality that made him the darling of fashionable society. Yet even in his youth, the seeds of ruin had already been sown. His father, George III, stern and devout, ran a household governed by strict moral discipline. For the young heir, this suffocating environment felt intolerable. By the time he reached his 21st birthday, George had taken up residence at Carlton House on London's Pall Mall. There he embarked on what would become a lifetime of steady self-destruction. The contrast with his father could hardly have been greater. While George III practiced restraint and austerity, the prince revelled in excess of every variety. He surrounded himself with reckless companions, drank on a staggering scale, and engaged in scandalous affairs that delighted cartoonists and gossip sheets. The 1780s marked the beginning of his metamorphosis from dashing youth to something far more sinister. His gluttony became notorious. Breakfast alone might include 2 pigeons, 3 beefsteaks, most of a bottle of white wine, champagne, port, and brandy, only the start of a day's feasting that stretched into extravagant lunches and dinners resembling Roman banquets more than civilized dining. As his body swelled, so too did his debts. By the 1790s, George owed staggering sums to London's leading merchants and moneylenders. Parliament repeatedly stepped in to rescue him, yet each bailout only fueled his extravagance. He seemed incapable of moderation, treating money as a limitless fountain to be drained for his amusement. His spending on wardrobes, palaces, art, and entertainments shocked even the most profligate nobles. His personal life fared no better. His unlawful marriage to the Catholic widow Maria Fitzherbert in 1785 created constitutional turmoil. His subsequent official union with Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795 proved catastrophic. Repulsed by her at their first meeting, George called for brandy. Caroline, unimpressed, remarked that he was overweight and far less handsome than his portrait. Their wedding night, during which George, dead drunk, passed out in the fireplace, set the tone for one of the most infamous royal marriages in European history. The pair's mutual disgust soon became fodder for satirists and a public hungry for gossip. Their constant feuding and eventual separation turned into open entertainment. George's cruelty toward Caroline, whom he later tried to discard when king, went beyond marital discord. He barred her from court, erased her name from the Book of Common Prayer, and attempted to exclude her from his coronation. When she died suddenly in 1821, many believed the relentless persecution by her husband had hastened her end. Meanwhile, George's body revealed the punishment of his excesses. By 1797, at only 35, he weighed around 245 pounds, immense by contemporary standards. The once celebrated face grew bloated, sprouting multiple chins that no cravat could disguise. His athletic frame vanished beneath thick layers of fat, making even basic movements difficult. Yet his vanity endured. Determined to project beauty despite reality, he relied on armies of tailors, corset makers, and cosmetics experts. His corsets were feats of engineering, designed to compress his enormous belly into an approximation of human form. He concealed thinning hair beneath wigs, painted his pallid skin with rouge and powder, and donned increasingly flamboyant costumes to distract from his decline. When George III finally succumbed to madness in 1810, his eldest son assumed authority as Prince Regent. While his father lived out his final years in derangement, George gained full control. The Regency period, lasting until George III's death in 1820, might have been the peak of his career. Instead, it marked the quickening of his fall. transforming him from merely dissipated prince into something both pitiful and alarming. As regent, George held unmatched power to shape Britain. He ordered grand architectural works, supported artists on a lavish scale, and oversaw glittering social seasons that dazzled London. But beneath the glitter lurked rot. His drinking escalated to levels that shocked even his hard-drinking circle, while his dependence on laudanum, liquid opium, clouded his mind for days. His legendary feasts became grotesque displays that horrified foreign visitors. In just 6 weeks of 1816, Carlton House received more than £5,000 of meat, excluding poultry and sausages. George himself consumed amounts that seemed beyond human capacity, drowning it all in oceans of wine and spirits that left him in stupors lasting hours. His dinner parties stretched from afternoon until dawn, with horrified guests slipping away in disgust. By the time George became king in 1820, he was already an object of ridicule rather than reverence. His coronation, costing nearly £1 million, an astonishing figure then, epitomized his mania for excess. Wearing a crown glittering with 12,000 hired diamonds, he stuffed his massive frame into robes of silver tissue. Observers compared him to a great whale dressed for a masquerade. The first years of his reign were marred by political blunders that exposed his unsuitability for rule. His attempt to divorce Caroline turned into a national spectacle, alienating the public. His interference in policy revealed a shallow grasp of statecraft. Parliament learned to sideline him, treating him less as a sovereign than as a ceremonial burden to be managed. As the 1820s wore on, George's health collapsed with frightening speed. His weight soared beyond 280 pounds, making him one of the heaviest men in the kingdom. His legs swelled with fluid until walking was agony. Stairs were out of the question, and servants were forced to carry him like a piece of overstuffed furniture through his own palaces. The image of a monarch too heavy to move on his own, yet draped in finery for the public, created a cruel dissonance between reality and illusion. By then, his addiction to laudanum had reached perilous levels. He regularly swallowed more than 100 drops before public appearances, enough to render most people unconscious. Instead of clarity, the drug left him drifting in a haze, barely able to concentrate on affairs of state for more than a few minutes. His speeches became wandering, incoherent rambles that embarrassed ministers and amused opponents. Foreign observers wrote home that the King of England seemed perpetually drunk or drugged. His eyesight also began to fail. Like his father, George developed severe cataracts, leaving him nearly blind by the late 1820s. Primitive surgery in 1829 offered little relief, and by the end of that year he could no longer sign his name. Parliament authorized a stamp of his signature to be pressed onto documents in his presence. The man who had once prided himself on elegant penmanship could not even write his own name. Gout, the fashionable curse of the wealthy, tormented him mercilessly. His hands and feet swelled grotesquely, so tender that even the faintest touch sent him into spasms of pain. His shoes had to be specially constructed to encase his enlarged feet, while his hands twisted so badly that he could no longer grasp pen or fork. The king, famed for refined manners, was reduced to being spoon-fed by attendants who recoiled at the task. The physical changes were shocking even to those who saw him daily. In 1829, the artist Sir David Wilkie painted his portrait, describing George as wasting away day by day despite his bulk. He likened the king to a sausage stuffed into its casing, a grotesque figure hardly human. Even Wilkie's official portrait, softened as royal convention demanded, could not entirely disguise the monstrous reality. Breathing grew increasingly difficult as his sheer weight crushed lungs and heart. He could not lie flat without risking suffocation, forcing him to sleep sitting upright in a custom-built chair propped by pillows and cushions. Even then his rest was broken by gasping fits and coughing that drove him to beg for more opium. His skin, once admired for delicacy, became a horror. Fat stretched it to splitting, creating folds that could not be cleaned properly. Infections and sores festered, refusing to heal. His face puffed until scarcely recognizable, greyish in hue, as if already decomposing. Servants described his flesh as doughy and revolting to the touch. The stench clinging to his body became infamous. Despite constant attempts by valets and physicians, his massive form defied proper hygiene. Infected sores, filthy folds of flesh, and the effects of medication produced a reek so strong that staff gagged upon entering his chambers. Visitors to Windsor reported smelling him from rooms away, the odour like that of a body already rotting. His appetite, far from diminished, grew more grotesque. Unable to taste food clearly under the fog of medicines, He demanded dishes ever more heavily seasoned. He devoured enormous meals, even while in obvious distress, choking for breath as he forced food into his mouth. To the staff, it was among the most degrading sights. A dying king, gasping while stuffing himself, incapable of stopping. For a man whose life had revolved around his appearance, the psychological toll of becoming a grotesque parody was unbearable. Mirrors were removed from his chambers at his command. The prince, who had once spent hours arranging his toilet, now refused to see his reflection at all. His paranoia deepened. Convinced his servants mocked him, often correctly, he flew into violent rages over imagined slights, then collapsed into hours of weeping. Drugged and unstable, he became a torment for those around him. Even his most loyal attendants began to dread their duties. As his isolation grew, George left his rooms rarely. On those occasions he appeared only in a specially built wheelchair, able to support his immense weight. The man who had once been the glittering star of London society now lived as a prisoner in his own palace. His relationships with doctors soured as his decline worsened. Sir Henry Halford, his physician, was often abused. Other doctors, too honest in their assessments, were dismissed. George wanted reassurance, not truth, promises that his weight might lessen, that his sight might return. He fired those who told him otherwise. For ministers the situation was alarming. A monarch scarcely able to function, addicted to drugs, and slipping into instability, threatened the very stability of the crown. Discussions turned to contingency plans for a sovereign physically alive yet incapable of ruling, a constitutional dilemma with no clear resolution. Despite the palace's efforts at secrecy, the public caught on. Satirical cartoonists, who had long mocked his obesity, now portrayed him as a literal dying corpse, a disgrace to the throne. The contrast between upbeat official bulletins, speaking of minor indispositions, and the dreadful reality was an ongoing joke among the people. Inside Windsor Castle, even staff lost respect. Footmen complained about carrying his enormous bulk, chambermaids whispered about the smell, and the rigid rituals of royal service began to break down. The dignity of monarchy crumbled in proportion to the king's own. His nights were chaotic. Unable to sleep, he drifted into fitful naps during the day, and demanded company at night, ranting incoherently under the influence of opium. Servants drew lots to decide who must endure his midnight ramblings. His drinking never slackened. He still swallowed oceans of wine, champagne, and spirits, often mixed with laudanum, in doses that might have killed others instantly. His tolerance was astounding. What would have knocked another man senseless merely left him slurring and stumbling. By 1829, he was incapable of fulfilling even basic royal functions. He could not read papers, sign documents, or follow discussions. Government carried on without him. He was little more than a breathing carcass, occasionally issuing garbled orders no one heeded. Even moving him through his own residences had become a major challenge. A wheeled chair was constructed, but even this strained under his weight. The grunts of servants, the creak of equipment, and George's laboured breathing echoed through corridors, a soundtrack of monarchical decay. His hygiene, never robust, became almost non-existent. Baths grew rare, sometimes weeks apart, his body reeking unbearably. Visitors learned to breathe through their mouths in his presence. The gulf between the official image of kingly splendor and the creature encountered in private had never been wider. Addiction left his mind unstable. Periods of apparent lucidity alternated with confusion so profound he failed to recognize his closest attendants. Memory deserted him. He forgot conversations within minutes and raged when reminded. Suspicion poisoned his relationships. One of the strangest turns came with his sudden religious fervor. In his last months, he grew obsessed with divine forgiveness, pouring out endless confessions to shocked clergy. He recited his lifetime of sins with lurid detail that left priests unnerved. His piety may have been genuine, yet it changed nothing in his behavior. He remained unable to curb his appetites. His craving for laudanum grew insatiable. Physicians secretly diluted doses, fearing overdose, but George demanded ever more. Even food, his old companion, became grotesque obsession. Despite failing digestion and obvious agony, he insisted on elaborate multi-course meals, swallowing mechanically, heedless of his body's limits. Personal ties withered. His mistress, the Marchioness of Cunningham, gradually withdrew, unable to bear the sight of him. Friends invented excuses to avoid Windsor. He was left to the company of paid servants who barely disguised their disgust. As George's decline dragged on, his grotesque state began to poison the entire atmosphere of Windsor Castle. The smell surrounding him grew so overwhelming that even other members of the royal household fled. Queen Adelaide, wife of George's brother William, the future William IV, reportedly moved to different apartments, simply to escape the stench. Servants volunteered for duties elsewhere in the castle, rather than remain near the king's rooms. Those who could not avoid him wrapped cloths around their faces, as if entering a pestilential ward rather than a palace. Meanwhile, George's delusions grew more elaborate. At times he claimed to have fought at the Battle of Waterloo, despite never having left England during the Napoleonic Wars. His fantasies of military triumph contrasted pitifully with the truth, a helpless invalid, unable even to lift his head unaided. These delusions alternated with crushing depression, during which he would sob for hours over his wasted life. The final months of his reign became a parade of medical crises. His vast heart struggled to pump blood through his swollen body, often faltering into failure. The smallest exertion left him gasping, his face turning bluish-grey. Doctors recognized death was inevitable, but could not guess when, leaving the court in a permanent state of grim suspense. Pain was his constant companion. Gout, dropsy, heart failure, and failing organs created a torment no dose of laudanum could suppress. During nights, his agonized cries echoed through corridors, terrifying the staff. Even critics who despised him began to feel reluctant pity for such relentless suffering. Palace order collapsed under the strain. The rigid etiquette of royal service broke down as servants were forced to deal with realities no ceremonial training had prepared them for. Gossip about the king's grotesque body and foul condition spread openly within the household. The monarchy itself seemed to be rotting along with its sovereign. George was fully aware of his impending death, and terror consumed him. Despite his agony, he clung desperately to life, begging doctors for remedies that might extend his days. His fear of dying was so intense he resisted sleep, convinced he might not wake. This dread added a psychological torment to his physical pain, making his last weeks unbearable for those around him. Even his bowels became a matter of morbid concern. His body could no longer process the vast meals he consumed, leading to blockages that lasted for days. When relief came, it was often bloody, a clear sign his organs were shutting down. Such details, once unthinkable to share about a monarch, were now discussed openly among servants who had lost all sense of reverence. Clergymen who visited to offer comfort came away shaken. His confessions were long, explicit, and disturbingly graphic. Instead of quiet repentance, they felt like one final indulgence in recounting a lifetime of vice. His guilt was vast, but his ability to moderate himself remained non-existent. Politicians, meanwhile, awaited his death almost eagerly. His brother William, heir presumptive, was carefully briefed on protocol while George still lived. Ministers privately admitted relief at the thought of a new king. The split between public concern for the monarch and private anticipation of his passing revealed just how despised George had become. His last weeks were filled with false alarms. Several times, attendants believed him dying, only for him to revive briefly before collapsing again. These cycles exhausted everyone at Windsor, producing an atmosphere of permanent tension. His refusal to die quickly seemed like one final act of selfishness, a last inconvenience for those forced to endure him. By the end, George spent nearly all his time in the specially made chair that allowed him to sleep upright. The image of a monarch, unable to lie in his own bed, became emblematic of his total degradation. Servants watched him wheeze and struggle for air, his bloated body quivering with each labored breath. On June 25, 1830, his condition suddenly worsened. Breathing grew ragged, his skin took on a ghastly grey, and his doctors knew the end was near. Yet George himself refused to acknowledge it. He dismissed Sir Henry Halford for the night, and settled back into his chair as though nothing had changed. One of the few people to remain with him was Sir William Waller, his ophthalmologist, who stayed at his side that final night. The scene was simultaneously pitiful and moving, a monstrously swollen king dying, holding the hand of one of the last men who still cared. The contrast between the enormity of George's ruined body and the small, simple gesture of companionship revealed the loneliness of his existence. As dawn broke on June 26, George entered his last crisis. His breathing faltered, becoming irregular and shallow. Around 3 a.m., he suffered a violent, bloody evacuation that marked the collapse of his digestive system. Calling for his doctor, he cried out, "Sir Henry, fetch him, this is death," or as some accounts claim, mumbled incoherently before sinking into gasps. At 3:15 a.m., George IV died. His great head fell onto his attendant's shoulder as his tortured breathing ceased. His end was as undignified as his life had been. The autopsy exposed the full horror inside his body. Doctors found fat wrapped thickly around every organ, crushing his heart and kidneys. His stomach bore signs of the rupture that caused his last crisis. His liver showed the unmistakable scars of long alcoholism. In every way, his organs testified to decades of gluttony and drink. The news spread quickly through London, yet the reaction was unlike that for any previous monarch. Instead of grief, there was relief, even celebration. The Times ran perhaps the most brutal obituary ever printed for a British king. What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow? The paper concluded that no man had ever been less regretted. If George had a true friend in life, it said, none had ever been heard of. Even in death, humiliation pursued him. Preparing his body for burial proved almost impossible. His enormous size required specially built equipment and reinforced coffins. The casket, made of Spanish mahogany lined with lead, was so heavy that palace corridors needed protective boarding to prevent damage as it was hauled through. Even after embalming, the odor of decay seeped out, undertakers complaining of the stench. The lying-in state at Windsor Castle lacked real mourning. Crowds came less to grieve than to gawk. Curious to see the immense coffin, many wanted simple proof he was truly dead. The atmosphere was solemn only in form, not in feeling. The funeral itself turned into quiet farce. Courtiers whispered jokes during the ceremony. The mood was one of relief, not sorrow. William, George's brother and successor, displayed such visible eagerness for his new role that many remarked on his lack of decorum. George's chapel, the funeral service was noisy, not with tears but with restless attendees eager to finish the business. The contrast with the deep mourning of other royal funerals was stark. Even burial posed problems. The vault floor had to be reinforced to hold the weight of his coffin. Extra pulleys were required to lower it without disaster. George's sheer physical excess complicated even the final ritual of interment. The days immediately following George's death revealed how thoroughly he had estranged everyone around him. No heartfelt tributes appeared, no moving anecdotes of private kindness, no recollections of hidden virtues. Instead, the prevailing reaction was relief. Relief that a long national humiliation had finally ended. Britain was free of a monarch who had become a grotesque burden, both physically and symbolically. The Duke of Wellington, the most respected figure of the age, summed up what many thought. He declared George the worst man he had ever encountered in his life, selfish, deceitful, spiteful, and entirely lacking in redeeming qualities. Coming from a man who had known him for decades, this judgment carried enormous weight. It also mirrored the sentiments of those who had been forced to work with George throughout his reign. The transition to William IV was welcomed almost joyfully. Though eccentric and limited in his own ways, William at least functioned as a capable human being. After the horror of George's reign, his very normality was an improvement. The stark contrast between the two brothers, one a grotesque invalid, the other at least competent, underscored just how complete George's failure had been. Historians have struggled to find positive legacies in his rule. Some point to his patronage of architecture and the arts, which left lasting monuments in London. Yet even these achievements are overshadowed by his personal failures and the damage he did to the monarchy's reputation. Many scholars conclude Britain would have fared better had he never ascended the throne at all. From a medical perspective, George's death could have served as a lesson in the dangers of extreme overeating, alcoholism, and drug abuse. His was one of the earliest recorded cases of death from obesity-related complications in Britain. Yet few contemporary observers focused on health. Instead, they treated his demise as a moral fable, a cautionary story of indulgence and corruption destroying both man and crown. The satirical press seized upon his death with savage glee. Cartoonists mocked everything from his grotesque body to his oversized coffin. Lampoons depicted the king as a bloated whale being lowered into the vault, or as a corpse so large it required mechanical cranes. For artists long restrained by convention, George's passing offered a chance to unleash decades of pent-up contempt. The financial cost of his funeral added one final insult. The elaborate equipment, reinforced coffin, and specialized arrangements cost the treasury thousands of pounds at a time when Britain struggled with debt. Even in death, George proved more costly and troublesome than most. While official reports described mourning, the reality was closer to morbid curiosity. Those who came to Windsor Castle to view the coffin were less mourners than spectators. Many admitted they simply wanted to confirm the infamous monarch was truly gone. Observers noted an atmosphere more of relief than grief, as though the country had shrugged off a burden. During the funeral procession, decorum slipped further. Courtiers whispered jokes, others smiled thinly at the thought of renewal under William. The solemnity of royal death was replaced with impatience to see the ceremony end. Even within the family, the lack of sorrow was obvious. William himself was described as animated, almost excited, as though eager to take possession of the crown. The burial inside St. George's Chapel exposed once more the practical challenges of George's enormous size. Engineers had to reinforce the vault floor to bear the casket's weight. Ropes, pulleys, and supports were used carefully to lower the lead-lined coffin. The process itself, heavy and mechanical, seemed a grim metaphor for how George's physical excess had complicated every stage of his existence, even his final rest. In many ways, George IV's death was not merely the end of a man, but the symbolic collapse of a vision of monarchy based purely on spectacle and indulgence. His obsession with appearances, his endless feasts, his gilded coronations, all had crumbled into decay. By the end, he was not remembered as a sovereign, but as a grotesque cautionary figure, the monarch who had undone himself. The final legacy of George IV was one of shame and ridicule rather than admiration. No monuments of memory, no traditions of heartfelt remembrance, no cherished stories passed among friends survived him. What remained was a deep sense of relief that a reign of humiliation had finally ended. For contemporaries, the verdict was harsh but consistent. George had squandered every gift given to him. Born intelligent, handsome, and charismatic, he chose gluttony, vanity, and cruelty. His life demonstrated how indulgence, unchecked by duty, could corrode not just an individual but the very institution he represented. The monarchy under George became a theatre of excess. His obsession with feasts, clothes, jewels, and ceremonies left little space for governance or responsibility. The crown, instead of symbolizing stability, came to embody ridicule. To many Britons, his reign revealed the dangers of hereditary privilege unchecked by character. Medically, his death offered grim lessons. He was one of the first prominent figures whose demise could clearly be traced to obesity, alcoholism, and drug abuse. His swollen organs, diseased liver, and failing heart provided textbook examples of self-destruction. But instead of sparking serious medical reflection, his decline became fodder for satire. Doctors of the time treated his death less as science and more as moral warning. For Britain, George V became less a king to be remembered than a cautionary tale to be repeated. His reign taught the nation that monarchy required more than jewels and feasts. It required restraint, dignity, and public respect. He had none of these, and so he died, not as a beloved sovereign, but as a grotesque warning. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. George V was unloved, unmourned, and almost universally condemned. He had squandered his gifts, degraded his office, and transformed his own body into a symbol of decay. His death brought not grief, but relief, not reverence, but ridicule. He had lived as the first gentleman of England, in name, but died as little more than a bloated shadow, a corpse still breathing until June 26, 1830, when he finally succumbed to the ruin he had created himself.